much. We now have a few minutes for a Q&A, and I've already seen some hands up in the air. I'll call on you in 1 second. We'll go in rounds of 3. We'll also ask if there are questions from our virtual audience, so we have to keep in mind we're live streaming and they may have questions as well. But before we start the Q&A, this is the special issue of Food Policy. There are some copies available outside should you wish to pick them up when you leave. As Derek mentioned, you can also go onto the Food Policy site to see the articles, and you can also go onto IFPRI.org. It's the main feature right now on our website, and you can access that way as well. So questions, I'll start with John, and then I'll move over to that side of the room and go back and forth. John? And please, if you have a question for a specific speaker, let us know to whom.
Well, I have about 100 questions for all the speakers, so this is a great combination of inputs. And I think the one question I want to ask is the relevance of public sector investment in agriculture, which has been quite weak in Africa, and I always assumed was the source of a lot of the failure of investment by farmers in irrigation and agriculture. But I'm just wondering what you saw as the relative role compared with other regions of the failure of major public investment in infrastructure and irrigation.
Thanks very much. I have 2 quick questions for Tom. One is, most of the research you presented was from 3 or 4 countries. So how generalizable is this across Africa, or is it just a Kenyan, Zambia experience? And then the second is, how do these urban middle-class folks, whatever they are, how do they get land? Now, is there a land market out there? Who do they buy it from? How do they just sort of bribe public officials? Is it registered? All that kind of stuff. Because it's clear that the Ghana situation is a little different, because traditional authorities seem to have a lot of control, and so they're able to provide land to whomever they please, however that process takes place. Whereas it doesn't seem to be that the same in Kenya and Zambia.
I'll take one more. Front row, David.
David Lambert. I guess this is a political question. I understand, unlike in this country, the farm lobby in rural America has had enormous political power. My understanding is that in Africa, most of the political power is in the cities. We're now 50-50 urban-rural, and we're going to be 70% urban by 2050. What are the implications if the rural voice is not there, particularly on issues like water scarcity and things that farmers need? How does that play out? And I was fascinated that so many owners of farms are urban-based. So that's my question.
Okay, we'll start with those 3, and perhaps we'll start with the one directly to Tom. So on how generalizable are the conclusions, and then how does the urban middle class acquire land?
Jerry, thank you. Good questions. Yeah, we can't go too terribly far right now because these are based on 3 countries. However, we're in the process right now of doing 3 more. Southern Ghana, with the help, this is another collaboration between IFPRI and MSU. We're doing the same work in Southern Ghana. We think that it could be very different results there. Also in the process of doing Malawi right now, and Tanzania early next year. So there's 3 additional countries. So I think maybe the best thing to say, right, is that as more evidence emerges, we'll see whether the Ghana story, the northern Ghana story, is more representative, or whether it, Zambia and Kenya and so forth. We actually do. I think it may be Burkina, but not till next year. Yeah. Okay. Now, you asked a really interesting question. How did the land markets develop? How do they function? There's a lot of heterogeneity. In some African countries, customary land has already been fully converted, or almost fully converted, to statutory control. But in some of the countries that I work in, we're seeing a very interesting way in which land markets are developing. Most of the land in Zambia is customary land, 90%, 85%, 90%. Only 10% is statutory land, which is title deeded land. People already own that land. So there's a land market in that land, but that's a minority of the agricultural land in Zambia. So the way in which medium-scale, urban-based households, people get access to land is you generally follow something like this. You go to the local headman where you're interested in getting land, and you express some interest. That land, cannot be bought and sold as customary land. That's illegal. But you express some interest in acquiring 50 hectares or 100 hectares. And he'll introduce you to the chief, and there's a process involved. It usually involves some resources changing hands. And then the next thing that happens is that there's a certificate now that's given by the chief. It's not a legal document, but it shows that the chief has sanctioned that you have that land. Now, the owner of that certificate can now take it to a district authority and try to get that converted into a title deed. And if you're successful with that process, which quite a few are, it usually pays to know how to work through the system, and for those reasons it favors people with higher education, more money, the political entree. And then eventually that land will be title deeded, and it now converts from customary land into statutory land. Now, you multiply that at a very rapid scale, and this is how land markets develop. Well, of course. The land was owned by the chief, and whether it was used or not, it was probably not used, or very sparsely used, let's say. So one could say, in 2014, as long as there were no claimants on that land in 2014, that there's no problem, there's no opportunity cost. But as Milu and Derek have pointed out, there's going to be continued rural population growth in these areas. And in many of them, they've already exceeded their carrying capacity, broadly speaking. So the fact that that land may not be utilized in 2014 doesn't mean there's no opportunity cost of that land, especially as populations continue to grow. And if I may just say one last thing on this, if non-farm job growth would really continue fast enough, this would of course relieve the trade-offs, because many land pressures would be relieved by people migrating into urban areas and non-farm for jobs and stepping out, as Schengen has said. But the rate at which those non-farm jobs are growing is not that encouraging. Wage jobs is not that encouraging. So we can't just assume that that's going to happen. The other question by this gentleman here about the political economy, it's very interesting how the rise of medium-scale farms have changed the dynamics of the politics of agriculture. These farm lobbies, which are quite powerful in many African countries, which were set up generally by colonial governments and run for a long time by white farmers until independence, are now primarily being run by medium-scale farmers. Urban-based, educated, articulate, medium-scale farmers. And they're able to effectively lobby State House and sometimes have representatives based at State House to reflect their interests. And so it looks to me like a lot of the evolution of agricultural policy has been greatly shaped by this group in recent years. And I want to acknowledge Nick Sitko, for a political scientist and geographer in Zambia, who's done a lot of this work. Mm-hmm.
We also had one question, the first one from John about public sector investment, especially infrastructure irrigation.
Okay. Maybe I can talk briefly about the first one. Yes, I think the public sector has a role to play. And as I mentioned during my presentation, the case of Zimbabwe, the Goko area whereby, as I mentioned, it was invested by Sept. And the government moved in, cleared the Sept, and the private sector was also there supplying farmers with the inputs and all that. So the government, the public sector has a role to play. But unfortunately, most of the African government in quotes, they are political. Governments, and government invest where people are, but not where people are not, because there is where the votes are. So the areas where you would want the government to invest in to attract people to move from, the densely populated places to the less densely populated places, the government will never invest there. Maybe for the case of Kenya, where the medium-scale farmers are getting land from, the market to some extent serve the interests of the medium scale. They are the guys who have the connections and the money to overcome the transaction cost involved in, land markets. Before a farmer owning 2 hectares knows that there is land for sale in Kenya, I will have known in East Lansing. I don't mean I buy land, but I will have known. Somebody will be like, okay, there's this land for sale. So, and also there was also some political reasons as to why some of these people got land. We asked these medium-scale farmers at the time when they got their land, when they accumulated their land and got into medium-scale farming, and this coincided with early 1980s, early 1990s, and this is time when we had the structural adjustment programs, retrenchment. So that's money which was gotten from the send of packages going into buying land, and also. This is the time in Kenya we saw the introduction of competitive politics, the multi-party democracy, and land became a currency for buying political support. So that's what I wanted to add. Yeah.
Oh, that was a good answer, so I don't have too much to add, and it's a very, very complex question. I think one thing I started thinking about more from this point of view, and it goes back to work by Binswanger and others, is farming systems are very different. Low density areas, high density areas are very different, and they need different strategies for successful development and agricultural development in particular. In the high density areas, obviously, really it's about sustainable intensification or getting people out. And one thing we also commissioned, if you'll see in the case studies, there's actually an Asian case study too. We picked Indonesia as a case study because we think Indonesia has some characteristics that are similar to Africa. It's got areas of very high density, Java obviously, and then outer islands with lots of land, and that's somewhat similar to Nigeria's and other countries. And they pursued kind of every strategy we discussed actually. They had a green revolution for rice in Java. They addressed family planning quite proactively. They had migration to outer islands, not very successful. A lot of people moved back. So even in quite a relatively competent bureaucracy, there was resettlement programs were not very successful. And then they had land expansion, particularly oil palm. Derek Biley's in the audience. You can ask him all about that, which was, to some extent, public-private partnerships. I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong. And land expansion in general, probably, I would guess, involves more public-private partnerships, at least to make it pro-poor. This could be contract farming, it could be basic public investments to help with infrastructure and so on to open up new lands, and research as well.
Okay, if we're lucky, we may be able to get 2 more rounds in, and we do have a number of questions from our online audience. So I'll take another round here internally and then go to our virtual audience. 1, far back, 2, 3. So Shahid.
Yes, my name is Monica Dorhai, and I'm a visiting professor at Georgetown. And I used to work at World Bank for a long time. I'm still affiliated, but I'm mainly at Georgetown. My question is, I worked in Africa and the Middle East, and structurally, the #1 issue for land, whether it is used for crops or for just economic development, is, yes, land is available in Africa, but who was buying it? Very, very interesting. And the dilemma of the Chinese ownership and the different land policy regimes. It's very, very difficult to own a piece of land as a foreigner all over the world. And here's a bit my question. What do you see a bit in that field happening? Thank you.
Is it on? I wanted the mic just to thank Tom and Milo for working for free this afternoon at IFPRI. But Gwendolyn tells me that lunch was not free, so it's not entirely free. Most of us in this audience probably know that development experts were writing of Asia back in the 60s, work by Arak Brothers, and they were using labels like lifeboat ethics, these people are not going to make it, triage, famine 74, all kind of titles. Obviously, they were proved wrong in 20 years, and I hope 20 years from now, Tom and his gang are wrong because I want to be optimistic about Africa. But now, I have a question. Question is, you probably have done it in your special issue, but what I don't see in your one of the slides, that if you find that welfare indicators are going down after a threshold of population pressure, that should be reflected in the macro data. Then how do you see poverty declining in Kenya, poverty declining in Ethiopia? These are the countries you have looked at. And how do you see inequality remaining almost the same? Now, if I take your numbers, household survey data numbers, and your projection and all the results, that should be reflected in macro data. So macro data seems to be contradictory to what you were presenting here from the special issue. Maybe I missed it, maybe you have it in your special issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And last question in this round, far back.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask a question about what types of investments we're putting into policy, maybe policy experiments, because I think investors, first of all, I would like to add one category to your list, Tom. It's politicians. I mean, they're responding. If we look at everyone as investors, they're all responding to demand. They want to buy land. They have money, and that's why they're doing that. But what are we, and then we have mismatch with how much is going into things like fertilizer subsidies. What should we be investing in terms of policy innovations? Like what can we do to convince policymakers to switch from things, inefficient investments to high yield investments to sort of ease some of these pressures that we're talking about?
Okay, so we have 3 questions. Sure, Tom, if you'd like to start off, and then we'll move on. We only have a few minutes left, and I would like to get to our virtual audience as well. Thanks.
Okay, so Shahid, great question. Your question was, if I understand it right, is what's really happening that would lead the macro data to say one thing and micro data to say something else? That's going to take too long to get into with the time that we have, but I think the short answer that to the best of my knowledge is that when you start to unpack the micro data and you see things like what I was showing you about the fact that maybe 10% of the farms are driving overall aggregate growth in agriculture, you can arrive at a conclusion where most of the microdata is painting a stagnant picture and not a very good picture for smallholder agriculture, at the same time that you have high rates of growth at the macro level overall. So that's a little bit of that's quite a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it has some explanatory power for what we're talking about. Derek, did you want to add to that?
Sorry. So one is that, yeah, we are being pessimistic in an optimistic time. And I think there's two. There's diverse stories. So in the special issue too, John Mellor's paper talks quite a bit about positive signs in Ethiopia and Ghana. Within Ethiopia and Ghana, particularly Ethiopia, I think there's a lot of regional variations, successful intensification in some areas, quite unsuccessful intensification in other areas. But then there's other countries where you're seeing good signs from the macroeconomic data, like Zambia, like Mozambique and Tanzania, but not really seeing much poverty reduction. And there may be, in all these countries, there's arguably controversies about poverty measurement as well, serious issues. But in many countries, you're seeing quite strong growth and not that much poverty reduction. A second factor is, I mentioned that Africa's had sluggish growth in yields until recently. Why until recently? I don't think it's that much to do with agricultural investment in most countries. There may be some exceptions. I think it's higher food prices. there actually has been a supply response to higher food prices. You look at yields for rice and maize in Africa, it all kicks up in 2008. So we're living in a time of higher food prices. We've seen some supply response. It's not obvious that that'll be sustained unless there's better agricultural development strategies. Maybe higher food prices will catalyze some reinvestment in agriculture.
Just quick one on public investment. There's, in Kenya, government has moved from the centralized kind of planning to devolved kind of system. There before, the Ministry of Agriculture used to make one size fits all. Everybody fertilizer subsidies, but now we are having a situation whereby, well, at the moment you have a minister of the central government of agriculture who is a career procurement officer. So I can tell you the fertilizers got in Kenya in time. But at the county level, the governors are like, wait a minute, I don't think we need the fertilizers for now. We need to know the soil health of the quality of our soils to know exactly whether these are the fertilizers we need. So with the devolution, I think we will be more focused on where to invest our resources. Then the last one is about the micro and macro indicators. And the reason as to why I moved from macro to microeconomics was because macro is not well defined, but micro is, because when you talk to these farmers, you can see they're experiencing problems, even though the national statistics are showing that things are really working well. Thank you.
Go right ahead. Yes.
Okay, so for the speaker from, the person from Georgetown that had questions about buying land, selling land, one of the things we haven't talked about at all so far, which is really important in Africa, increasingly important, land rental markets. Land rental markets 20 years ago appeared to be virtually negligible, but they're rising rapidly now, especially in densely populated areas. And there has been quite a bit of research that's been done on this in recent years. I think that to summarize who's acquiring that land, they tend to be small farmers, small rural people who are land constrained, and yet they're productive farmers. And so they're acquiring land, usually households with a lot of land, idle land. Even some of the medium scale farmers are renting out that land. So that's kind of where the transactions in land rental markets are coming from. And it's generally a positive story that there's efficiency advantages to giving that land to people who are going to use it productively. So I hope I didn't imply that the rise of these land markets is sheerly one of political economy exploitation, by politicians. That certainly is going on, but at a different level, there's land rental markets that I think are helping to relieve poverty and so forth. I would echo what Derek said a moment ago, that Africa is so heterogeneous about poverty reduction, and I think this was in response to Shahid, that yes, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Ghana, there's 3 cases where the evidence is solid that poverty rates are going down. Good things are happening in those 3 countries. But I can list you 4 or 5 where they're not going anywhere. Zambia, Tanzania, Malawi, there's debate about whether poverty rates are actually going down in Malawi or not, but the World Bank says no. Which other ones? There's at least 4 or 5 where the data seems like it's not going down. So, anyway, let me stop there.
So I'm mindful that we have come to the end of our time, but I would like to ask your patience just for a minute or 2 longer to at least get one of our virtual questions in, to be fair. So Simone, would you mind reading?
Sure, I'll take one that I think should be simple. David James on Twitter asks, what does a high-value crop really mean?
Who'd like to take that one? Eric?
Well, maybe it's a profound question. But, so, I mean, I think high-value crops have a longer tradition in Africa because of colonial settlement. This is a continent which gave the world cocoa and oil palm and coffee and also significant production in tea. And we do see in higher density areas that those high value, often non-food crops, cotton as well, are more important in Africa than they were in Asia. Yet there's surprisingly little research. I don't know, Tom's probably more in the ag-econ profession than me. I find there's surprisingly little research on cash crops in Africa. There's a few exceptions, but maybe not enough.
So I would define a high-valued crop as a crop or a mix of crops that provide high net returns to land and labor. So that in some places can be maize or any other food crop in certain agroecologies where it's appropriate and where that crop gives you the highest return. So we tend to think of high-valued crops in terms of industrial cash crops or maybe horticulture. It is in many areas, and then in many other areas it could be food. So it depends on the environment.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. And as a final reminder, video of today's seminar will be available online tomorrow, and of course the presentations will also be available. Thank you very much.